Yo, welcome to Sig Slayers, the comic signature show, period. I'm Mike, the Sig Slayer, chilling with Mark, the honorable villain. What up, fam?
What's up, Mike? Our next guest is a class act. He's tapped into my addiction for pinup and pulp fiction, man.
Oh, man, I can't wait. Joining us today, we have writer David Avallone joining us. But before we chop it up with David, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and please comment. All right, our next guest writes for movies, writes for television, and writes for comics. He writes Bettie Page and Elvira. I love it. He's currently collaborating with the Ninja Turtles co-creator Kevin Eastman on a new series, Drawn Blood. Ladies and gentlemen of the Stash Land, we bring to you the one and only David Avallone. What's up, David?
Not too much. How you guys doing?
We're doing great, man. It's a pleasure to have you. We're going to just dive right on in.
Sure.
David, since it's your first time joining us, we like to get our guests comic book origin story. In other words, how did you get your first gig in pro comics?
Excuse me. My first gig in pro comics, I had actually been making indie films for about 30 years, and it was grinding me down, man. It's a tough gig, getting the money, getting stuff together. There's never enough money. There's never enough time. And in 2014, a colleague that I was shooting some video for, who had connections in the comic book industry, read an old script of mine, and they said, you're a really good writer. I can't get you any work writing movies or television, but I can introduce you around to a couple of comic book editors. And at San Diego Comic-Con that year, I met Joe Rybant, who is the editor-in-chief. I think they call him the executive editor now. His title changes, but the job never changes. He's the top editor at Dynamite. So we talked about movies we liked and books and life experiences that we'd had and all that. And after a couple hours over a couple of drinks, Joe said, well, let me go back to New York City and see if I got anything for you. Dynamite's in Jersey, but I think they had an office in New York at the time. And anyway, long story short, they were doing some spin-offs from a Bill Willingham thing called Legendary. And at first they actually reached out to me about Legendary Green Hornet. And before I even had a second to get excited about that, they went, no, Legendary Vampirella instead. I think Andraco ended up doing, or he did Legendary Red Sonja. Anyway, long story short, I tried really hard to give myself a crash course on writing comics, because as a film guy, I loved comics, but it was film that I had studied my whole life, and not in a way that at all interfered with my enjoyment of film. But from a very early age, watching film, I was like conscious of cinematography and acting and directing and music and editing and how films were made, and I was fascinated by it. But I read comics, just a happy idiot turning the page, not thinking about how the story was being told, not thinking about the form and the format. So I reread Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics for probably the third or fourth time, because you absolutely gotta. And then I took my favorite comics down off the shelf, the classics, and looked at them and went, oh, New Frontier is 3 big CinemaScope panels on every page, and then every once in a while there's a splash. That's one way to tell a story that tells you it's a movie. Watchmen famously is the 9-panel pages, and then he occasionally breaks it up for a splash. American Flag, which I always evangelize for, is one of the most groundbreaking. It came out before Dark Knight and before Watchmen, and a lot of the things people think were invented over there, Howard got to first. And I looked at how Howard told stories, and I'm like, wow, this page has 18 panels on it. That's crazy. And he's telling story with typography. He's telling story with fonts. That's crazy. How do you do that? So I tried to absorb as much of that as possible, and then I dove in and wrote the best script I can. I also I was so paranoid about making sure that what I was writing would fit on a page, like someone could draw it, that I have a sketchbook, and I'm a terrible artist, and I drew the whole comic after I wrote it, just like laid out panels, stick figures, all that, because I just wanted to make sure it would work. And then it got sent off to an artist named David Cabrera, very good artist, and his pencils started coming in, and I compared them to my pages, which I had not shown him. And my pages looked like a 5-year-old had copied his pages. So I was like, good. What I'm conveying in the script is getting to the artist, and he's drawing something that kind of looks like like all of his choices are better, his perspective is better, his angles are better, but it's essentially what I thought it would look like. And I did that for about the first 2.5 comics. And then I went, I've got this. I don't need to do this anymore. But yeah, since then, Dynamite has more or less kept me employed for the full decade that I've been doing it. I also want to say, as an aside, I was 49 when I started this. When anybody says to me, oh, I'm too old to start something new, I'm too old to learn a new thing, I cannot tell you how great and how exciting and how invigorating it is. It's like learning a new language or moving to a new country at 49. Like, here's a whole new thing to study and get good at and try to get excellent at. And that's a great thing to take on it at any age. So I recommend it. And you're never too old to start it. Anyway, all that said, and that led to other jobs with other companies. And ironically, it led to the best jobs I've ever had in film and TV, because that's how the world works sometimes. So yeah, that's as full an origin story as I can give you.
I want to segue into the fact that we found out your father was a pulp writer as well.
Yep.
And so we wanted to get a little bit about, how did your father influence you in any way as a writer?
My dad was born in the Depression, grew up reading the pulp magazines, wanted to be a writer, joined the U.S. Cavalry during World War II, spent 3 years in Europe fighting Nazis, and then came home, got a job in a stationery store in Manhattan, and started writing novels. And he wrote 6 novels before one of them got picked up. Imagine that. Imagine going to a day job like selling stationery, selling pens and pencils in New York City, and you come home to some tiny little apartment and you're just writing novels, and you get 5 novels rejected, and then the 6th one gets accepted. And then, honestly, over the next 30-40 years, he wrote about 200 published novels. He was very prolific. And he worked in, and this is where it's an influence on me, he worked in every genre or style. He was mostly famous for writing a Private Eye series called Ed Noon. And if you look those up on Amazon, I sell those as PDFs, as ebooks currently. And they're great. They're great fun. But he wrote gothic romance novels, usually under women's names. He wrote horror novels. He wrote very little science fiction. But his first published thing was actually a short story in Weird Tales, and it's a great story. And he did a lot of work, but partially because he was a movie nut. He did a lot of work in the tie-in space. So he wrote novelizations of movies like Beneath the Planet of the Apes, and nonsense like Cannonball Run and Friday the 13th Part 3. And he wrote, he was very big on TV tie-ins. So he wrote the first Man from U.N.C.L.E. novel, the Girl from U.N.C.L.E. novels, Mannix, Hawaii Five-0, The Partridge Family, which I got to tell you is the most money he ever made because he had a good royalty on The Partridge Family. And the 2 philosophies that he stated, which have stayed with me forever, is he was quoted in Who's Who in America once saying, a writer should be able to write anything from a garden seed catalog to the Holy Bible. a gig is a challenge, and there are a couple of things in my life where I've gone, yeah, I don't think I want to write that, but mostly I will go, sure, let's give that a shot. Let's see if we can write that. I've written for role-playing games. I've written stuff I never thought I would have written, honestly. And the other thing he said, which is more an overall philosophy being in the freelance professional arts at all. He had a sign over his desk, which I have over my desk, which is, nobody asked you to be a writer. And, you can read that a couple of ways, obviously. But to me, it always says, you chose this, man, so enjoy it. You better enjoy it. You don't enjoy it, go put up drywall somewhere. Right. Go dig ditches for the city. Like, there's other shit you can do. You can sling coffee at a diner. You don't have to do this. Nobody's making you do this, man. So he had a joy for it, which I have. And he had very little patience for writers who were all about the struggle. And I rewrote this sentence 500 times. And he was like, come on, man. Get the words out, get them to the people.
I want to talk a little bit about your resume. It's filled with pulp and pinup characters such as Bettie Page, Elvira, The Shadow. What draws you to these classic American archetypes? Well,
I got to say, all of those that you mentioned were things that were honestly offered to me, and I was very happy to take them. And usually when you're a freelance artist, you don't go to the publisher or the TV studio or the movie studio and say, I want to write. They go, here's what we'd like you to write. And I think Joe knew about my dad's background a little bit when he hired me. And at the time, Dynamite had the licenses for The Shadow and Doc Savage. And I think I said to him at the first meeting, I was like, among other things, I'm about the only guy under 60 who's going to be able to write Doc Savage or The Shadow for you without running a Wikipedia to remind myself who they are. I've actually read this stuff and I love it and I have a passion for it. But the second job he gave me was The Shadow, and the third job he gave me was Doc Savage, and I had so much fun with those. And yeah, he offered me Betty, and I had a moment of she's not a comic book character, in spite of the great work of Dave Stevens. She doesn't necessarily have adventures. What do you do with that in a comic? And I watched a documentary on her called Bettie Page Reveals All. That was narrated. They found an audio interview with Betty telling about her whole life. And I listened to it, and she was just great. And she was fascinating. And I was like, I can write that character. Now I just have to come up with a fun framework to put her in, where she can be fearless and shameless and funny and tough in the way that Betty was all those things. And I had done research for this project that didn't go anywhere there's this crazy connection between the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the Thelema cult, and Scientology. Guy named Johnny Whiteside Parsons was the American head of this free love anarchist cult. And he also was America's foremost rocket engineer and founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And at one point, he had a really close friend who ran off with his wife, and it was L. Ron Hubbard. And it was such a crazy-ass fun story that I was like, maybe Betty gets a job as John Parsons' secretary. And just gets and the federal government reaches out to her to keep an eye on Jack, and you got Roswell and UFOs and mind control and all of the fun stuff of 1950s sci-fi and film noir culture. I was like, I can kind of hit all of these. I wrapped up the Parsons story. I called him Chaplin. I changed everybody's names. So that Scientology didn't sue me out of existence, I called him Elroy Benway instead of L. Ron Hubbard. But fifth issue, I did a giant radioactive scorpions in the desert issue. Issues 6 through 8, no one has ever done this in a comic book. I'm pretty sure they went to the Cannes Film Festival in 1953, so I could talk about all the And it's a Russian spy thing where they're handing off an alien artifact. But I said it at the Cannes Film Festival because 1953 is a great year for film, and I got to make some jokes about some of my favorite films from 1953. Then I did an arc where I realized, oh, she's the same age as Queen Elizabeth. She's 27 when Elizabeth is ascending to the throne. So I did a series where Elizabeth, right before her coronation, is kidnapped by a UFO, and British intelligence calls on Betty to help her figure out what happened and get Elizabeth back. That one's called The Princess and the Pinup. I just had all the fun I could have with her. And then as I was wrapping up the first Betty series, Joe had dinner with me and said, we're having trouble getting an Elvira comic off the ground. And I will totally admit that my first response was, oh man, is this the stupid niche you guys are going to have for me where it's make the hot lady who's not really a comic book character? And I love Elvira. I'm an Elvira fan. But once again, I was like, what kind of adventures am I going to have with her? And I got a lot of help from my wife, who's a big Elvira fan, and was like, oh no, you're taking this because I want to meet her. And I did. Did get to, we all went out to dinner once, and it was delightful. And the artist that I was working with very much at the time, Dave Acosta, who's amazing, helped me out, and he said, you're thinking too hard about this as like a horror book, but it's a comedy book. It's Mad Magazine doing satires of horror. That's what you should really lean into. So that's what we ended up doing. And because she's the horror hostess that like introduces people to horror movies, right. In the first series, I had her time traveling, and she meets Mary Shelley in the first issue, and she meets Edgar Allan Poe in the third issue, and she meets Bram Stoker, writer of Dracula, in the third issue. And in the fourth issue, she's on the set of The Bride of Frankenstein and stuff like that. So I have found, 30 some issues later, I have found plenty of things to do with Elvira. But it's, I never want to present it as like, oh, these were my choices. I absolutely wanted to do The Shadow and Doc Savage. I wouldn't have told you I wanted to write Bettie Page and Elvira, as much as I love them. It took me a minute to figure out what I was going to do with them. And there are still things, Dynamite has the James Bond license. I have been pitching untenable things for James Bond for 2 years, and every time they go, come on, man. We're not going to talk him into doing that story, but I'll nail something with Bond eventually, I think.
David, can you tell us a little bit more about your experiences writing film, and how does that really differ from, what exactly does that differ from writing comics?
What they have in common is a movie script is a set of instructions ultimately to a film crew about what the story is and how you're going to tell it. A comic book script, I think Neil Gaiman once said, is basically a letter to an artist. Like, the editors got to understand it. If there's a client like Cassandra Peterson or the Bettie Page estate, they got to understand it. But really, you're trying to convey to an artist, what are you going to do?
Let's go back to Elvira real quick, David.
Sure.
Has a rich history in comics, obviously, and you kind of alluded to the question, so we want to ask you straight up: does Cassandra Peterson have any input on what happens to Elvira in multimedia?
Total input.
Okay. Total input.
She doesn't. There have been a couple of exceptions to this, but mostly, I come up with a pitch, depending on the length of the series, or we've done one shots or whatever. I come up with a pitch for a 4 to 5 to 8 issue series that's only a couple of paragraphs. I say, this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. Issue 2. This is going to, like the first series. It was like, I think I wrote a paragraph for all 4 issues. And she went, yeah, great. And then issue 2, they said to me, oh, we want to go another 4 issues. And I went, okay. Remember the second pitch that we didn't choose? I want to do that one for 5 through 8, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yeah. And they're like, okay, yeah, we'll do that second pitch. The one that came in second. That was Elvira's Inferno, where she goes to hell. And Cassandra reads every script, And 99.999% of the time, what I get back is, I love this. She corrects spelling as though we're not going to get around to that, which I think is wonderful. It's like she can't help herself. I'm like, Cassandra, we're on that. Don't worry about it. But mostly what I get is 1 to 3 joke alternatives, where she's like, on page 5, instead of saying X, how about I say Y? And she's so kind. It always comes with, now, David, you don't have to use this. This is just an alternative for you to think about. And I'm like, it's an Elvira joke written by Elvira. I think I'm going to use it. So cool. Only once did I have her throw out a whole issue. And I didn't want to poke the bear and ask her why she hated it so much. But it was something where I was being self-indulgent, and it was the Cronenberg issue of Elvira in Horrorland. And I had the issue be mostly about Naked Lunch, which is a movie I love that nobody else loves, and I think it's very clear Cassandra does not love. So I switched it and made the issue mostly about The Fly, and then she literally had no notes. After saying, I hate this, throw it out. So, but every other time, and there's been at least 1 or 2 times where I don't have a good joke for something, and it's 2 a.m. and I don't want to like beat my brains out trying to get like the exact, and I go like, you know what, I'm gonna leave this lame thing here, and Cassandra is totally this is gonna be one of the things she pulls out. And every time she catches the lame joke and has a better alternative than I had. I've only done like 2 or 3 times where I've been like, I could kill myself getting this joke right, but I don't have a good one. And even if she has 1 note in the issue, it's always the thing that I knew was lame. And she's like, nope, gotcha. So yeah, she's very involved in a couple of things. Like we did a Kickstarter special during the pandemic, where for that she said, I'm going to be, a little more involved this time. And we jumped on the phone and had a great conversation for 2 hours and laughed and laughed and laughed. And I couldn't honestly tell you, and this is true of so many collaborations, I couldn't tell you what in that book is her and what is me. I think she came up with the idea. It's called the Omega Ma'am, and it's basically Elvira goes into a coma at the beginning of the pandemic because she overdoses on hairspray. And she wakes up not 28 days later in a hospital, and Los Angeles is deserted except for a bunch of zombies who have been convinced by a influential public figure to ingest a cleaning product to cure themselves of COVID, and it makes them turn orange. And I think the turning orange was Cassandra's. I think I had them turn into like basic zombie movie ghouls, and she said, no, they should turn orange. Pretty sure that was hers. But the rest of the book, I couldn't tell you what was hers and what was mine. And we collaborated on a comic that was sort of based, sort of a satire of her memoirs. And that night that I talked about, me and Cassandra and my wife went out for dinner, was literally because I called her up and said, tell me some anecdotes that you're putting in your book because I want to build a comic around them. And she's like, oh, David, that can't be a phone call. We got to sit somewhere with martinis and, talk it out. So we had dinner at the Dresden Room with my wife, and I had a notepad and I took down stuff, and then all of it ended up in her memoir as well, which is fun. But yeah, so she is totally involved. Like on the other side of things, like Bettie Page is obviously long gone. The input I get from them, which is wonderful when I've written Betty, is we love it. It's great. That's it.
All right, on to your current project with another legend. Went from Cassandra Peterson, Elvira, to Kevin Eastman, co-creator of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So we wanted to know, how did you get involved with that book behind you, Drawn Blood?
Kevin and I were both I was a baby comics writer. I think I had maybe done the first series. And I went to Emerald City, excuse me. I went to Emerald City Comic Con because I thought it'd be good for my career, and I wanted to meet editors and meet my fellow professionals and be a part of the community. And I was sitting in a hotel bar which is where everything happens at a convention. And Kevin came in with a colleague of mine and sat down. They decided to sit with me, and Kevin sat next to me, and we struck up a conversation. And we had, in spite of having very different resumes, there are some weird overlaps in our life. He was also friends, for example, with Andy Sedaris, that exploitation filmmaker. He knew Andy through his ex-wife, Julie Strain. So we had a whole bunch of, like, we didn't overlap, but Andy was a good friend to both of us, and he had recently passed away. And I was working at Limelight Music Videos production company, and I quit in 1989, and a month later they started production on the first Ninja Turtles movie. So we could talk about how the president of that company was a cokehead and have laughs about it, even though we had just met. I hope Simon doesn't hear this. But all that said, we hit it off, and we had again, when I talk about networking, I don't know that the word Ninja Turtles came out of my mouth for the first 2-3 years that Kevin and I were friends. It was not a thing that was an interesting topic of conversation. When you meet George Lucas in a bar, you don't say, "Hey man, I want to talk to you about Star Wars," because he's going to run the fuck away from you. So Ken and I talked about World War II comics that DC published in the 70s. I remember that clearly. That was our big first conversation. And we became friendly, and I was doing work for IDW at the time, and he was in-house at IDW at the time. So we saw each other at IDW events a couple of times, had drinks and dinner around that a few times. And then as we were getting to be really good friends, I think it was San Diego 2016, we were having drinks at the Bayfront while he was waiting to do a signing. And he, out of left field, said to me, "I've been working on this semi-autobiographical thing about the life of a cartoonist, where I want to just sort of tell all the fun, crazy stories that we know about the comic book industry and about the film industry, because he's been in it as much as I have really over the years." And it seems like something, he's like, "I haven't been able to crack it. I have a title for it that I hate." And he talked to me a little bit about it, and then he had to go to his signing, and we walked together up along the bay to go to in the back door for the signing. And as we were walking, I was thinking, I'm sure I can nail this gig if I can come up with a good title for this thing on the walk. And as we went through the back door, I was thinking about metaphors of the struggles of being an artist, being a freelance artist in this world, and comic books and cartooning, and what's a thing that expresses all that. And when we walked in the back door, I tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Drawing Blood." And he went, "Man, that's it." Kevin's a very enthusiastic guy. And we got to work on it from then. And we actually, excuse me, we originally developed it as a TV pilot for he had originally, I think, thought of it as, he had notes for it as a comic, and he was unsatisfied with going that way based on his notes. And then he was like, "Well, what about a feature film?" And then when there was so much material, I said, "Well, what about a streaming cable prestige TV, Mad Men, Breaking Bad kind of thing?" Because it's an adult contemporary comedy drama, black comedy kind of a thing. And like Mad Men, it's set in a very specific culture and world, and all of that. And he liked that, so I wrote a pilot script for him, and then we took a little bit of time trying to sell that, and we weren't happy about how that process went. And the world is full of people who are like, "Oh, I'm going to turn my failed TV movie project into a comic book." But I think we were a little more genuine than that. We're comic book guys who like making comic books, and we're like, no, let's do it let's do it our way. Like, we were getting notes back from studios. We're like, nah, I don't want to do that. I don't, people are like, oh, give him a dog, give him a kid. I'm like, what are you even talking about? Like, that's not what this story is. So we decided to do it as a comic. We kickstarted the first volume. It was very successful. We kickstarted the second volume. That was successful, but it has been a bear to complete, partly because of the COVID hit right when we were getting into the weeds with it, and we all had to like scramble looking for other work. Because Kickstarter is great, but it's got to be, supplemented by all the other stuff we do to make a living. And then IDW decided to go ahead with Last Ronin, and Kevin called me up and said, I really need to borrow our series artist Ben Bishop for Last Ronin. I was like, oh, that's going to kill us on Drawing Blood, but I give you my blessing. Take Ben. I said, honestly, everybody that loves Drawing Blood is going to be reading The Last Ronin, so like, it's not like we're not giving him anything. We're giving him something amazing. And then in the fullness of time, we reached out to Image, and they were very excited about taking it on. And so we started talks with them last year, and then I think our first issue came out, 4 was July, so June, May, April. Our first issue came out in April. And we timed it to sort of coincide with Last Ronin 2 a little bit to ride some coattails there. And the first trade will drop in, I think, October, which has the first 4 issues. And it has the comic within the comic, the radically rearranged Ronin Ragdolls, which are that's the Turtles analog that our hero creates inside Drawing Blood. And because it's a comic about comic book creators, we've had to create a bunch of other comic book characters. Issue 4, which is the last issue that came out, the main character is at New York City Comic-Con, and he meets a teenage girl with a webcomic called Get the Fuck Out Girl, GTFO Girl. And I asked Kevin for permission to do this, and he was very much on board. And I had 2 great creators, Amanda Dibert and Sky Partridge, do a 4-page Get the Fuck Out Girl comic to illustrate that, here's another thing in our world, so we're having a ton of fun with it. Obviously, we don't necessarily ever have to do more Drawing Blood if there's no demand, or if we decide we don't, but we have stories. We have a full 2 more seasons of Drawing Blood that we have in mind. But yeah, I'm prouder of it than anything I've ever done. It's the most personal work I've ever done. People are obsessed with how much of it is based on the real world.
Well, David, can you tell me this? What are some of your influences as far as storytelling? And have you ever met any of them? Yeah,
I have. I mean, being in film for so many years, I have met people that I admired and was a fan of and all that. But the comics industry is so small that, Kevin was an influence on me, and I have, met him and become friends with him. Matt Wagner, huge influence on my storytelling. Chaykin, I would go so far as to call a friend. We've met at cons and hung out quite a bit. And it's wild to be with those people and to be able to talk shop with them and to be able to, I'm still learning from Howard. I'm still learning from Kevin. Every time I interact with them, I get something out of it. I recently became friends with Joe Duffy, who wrote 20, 30, 40 issues, the last of Star Wars at Marvel Comics. And that's wild. And I love her. She's great. And did such fun, interesting things with Star Wars in comics. In film, I've met fewer of Like some of my influences were dead long before. Orson Welles is a huge influence on me. If you go back and look at my first series, Legendary Vampirella, it is nonstop Orson Welles references on every other page in that thing. Fellini, huge influence on me. I'm never gonna meet Fellini. He's been dead for years. The Coen brothers, huge influence on me. And even like as a writer, my father, huge influence on me. Dashiell Hammett, James M. Cain, Philip K. Dick, all of those things I'm all dead. I will never be lucky enough to meet them. But I still make friends and colleagues. The great Gary Phillips is a friend of mine now, terrific modern pulp writer. So it's comics in particular is a very warm and welcoming community. I think partly because there aren't that many of us compared to film, compared to some of the other arts, and we're all at the same convention, sitting behind tables, getting to, it's like, yeah. And in comics, Kirby is probably the biggest influence on me in comics because he's a titan. Like Howard would tell you that it starts with Eisner and Kurtzman. And he's right, but I wasn't reading Eisner and Kurtzman when I was a kid. I was reading Kirby, and discovered Eisner and Kurtzman much later, when more of my artistic sensibility had already been formed. But yeah, that's and the thing is, I think if you take this stuff seriously and you want to do it, you never stop having new influences. And you see, you look at someone like Wes Anderson, who I love, and it's like, yeah, we're both in the Kubrick boat together and a little bit in the Fellini boat together. It's like I can see, and in the Coen brothers, I can see Dashiell Hammett and the Looney Tunes are all over their work. Raising Arizona is just a 90-minute long Roadrunner cartoon, and it's a brilliant one. And the influence of those, directors, like Preston Sturges on them and all that. But anyway, I keep you here all night talking about influences, but those are really the major ones. And again, as I said, the ability to talk comics theory with someone like Chaykin or someone like Eastman or someone like Matt Wagner is invaluable, and it blows. Like, there are times when I think, like, get in the time machine and go back to 1983 and find me in college reading American Flag and go, you're gonna hang out with this guy. You're gonna have some significant time hanging out with this guy. And I would go, on what planet is that gonna happen? There was a moment I always think of when I went to New York City Comic Con, and I had met Matt Wagner a couple of times at a couple of different cons. I had no idea if I had registered on him in any way, shape, or form. And I hear someone call my name, David. And I look over and it's Matt Wagner at his table, and he waves me over. And as we're walking over, my wife whispers in my ear, "Bet that feels pretty good, doesn't it?" And I said, "Yeah."
That's so awesome.
Really feels good. You're right.
Tell us about your podcast, Pulp Today and the Writer's Block.
The Writer's Block, I mean, I always joke that when I talk about the podcast, I started them both in 2020. And I always say to people, if you would come up to me in 2019 and said, "I'm from the future, and in 2020, you're going to start 2 podcasts," I would absolutely have said, "Does the world end? Like, how do I find the time? I don't want to do that. Why am I doing that?" But then the world ended, and 2 things happened. One was my friend Ryland Grant, very good writer, screenwriter, comic book writer. And Ryland is a big cheerleader for comics as a community, and he always puts together great panels for conventions. And he said, "I've been thinking about doing a comics podcast, and I want to recreate, like, we're not going to be in conventions for a year. Like, it's not going to happen. So I want to recreate that thing of us all sitting in the bar at the end of a convention. Like, we'll do a podcast, we'll have 1 or 2, 3 people on, and we'll sit around, shoot the shit about comics, about what they're working on, what we're working on, whatever. And we did it. And we're up to episode 114. We just recorded an episode with Chris Longo, really great comics writer and editor, a few days ago. We won a couple of awards for it, which is really nice. We did an episode with New Yorker cartoonist Emily Flake and LA cartoonist Lalo Alcaraz that won a Public Affairs podcasting award. And so we're proud of that, and that continues to go on. And, you know, between me and Ryland, we both kind of like make sure we both keep doing it. And we get a little lazy sometimes, and we will just like record one of our panels at a convention and go, here's another episode. The last 2 were like that. But, and then the other one, I saw Sir Patrick Stewart was on Instagram, and he decided to do a pandemic project where he sat in his nice garden every day and had his Shakespeare sonnet book. And he was like, today I'll read, How Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? You know, and he would sit in his garden and read Shakespearean sonnets, you know, and they were short. And he's Patrick Stewart, so they're great. And I was like, what's my version of Patrick Stewart sitting in his garden reading? And I had I'm doing this for me. I'm doing this to give myself an excuse to shave and put on a clean shirt and get out of my bathrobe and record a video. And I thought about specifically, there's this section of The Maltese Falcon called the Flitcraft story. It's the only thing that John Huston cut out of the movie, because it's basically Sam Spade sitting and telling Bridget O'Shaughnessy a story. But it's a brilliant piece of writing, and a lot of writers are obsessed with it, not just me. And I was like, I should do a thing where I just read the Flitcraft story. And then a friend of mine said, you should do a thing where you read other things, not just that. And they even said, you know, start with your dad. And I went, you know, that's a good idea. So I created something. I think it initially had a different name, but I've eventually settled on Pulp today. And it's me reading from, doing a little, you know, 1-page to 10-page reading from my favorite book, whatever it is, and talking about what it means to me, why I like it, all that. And I topped out at 75 episodes of that, and I do have every intention of getting back to it. Someone asked me to come on their podcast and talk about Quentin Tarantino, and I went, not in a million years. Not in a million years. I am not going to go shit in the cornflakes of everybody that loves Quentin Tarantino. Not interested. I will talk about it. You want to talk to me about it at a bar? Absolutely. But I don't want to talk about a thing where I'm going to get angry and talk about all the things about it that piss me off. So I sort of ran out of books where I'm like, I know this thing like the back of my hand. I'm going to, you know, knock it out. So I'm still doing like some reading to remind myself, like, oh yeah, I love this. Let me talk about this. And sometimes I decided it would be fun to have on friends to talk about their favorite book. I think one of the first ones I did was, I'm friends with the actor James Urbaniak, who's, you know, Professor Venture from the Venture Brothers, great actor, great voiceover actor. And I reached out to James and said, would you do one of these Pulp Todays with me? And he's like, oh, I'm reading Ask the Dusk by John Fonte. Can I do a whole chapter? I was like, absolutely. You're great. Like, come on and read a whole chapter. And I will be absolutely honest with you. One of the reasons I got the idea to have people on, this is definitely a confession. There are books that I love that I don't think I should be doing a live reading of. I don't want to be on a microphone reading Chester Himes, reading black characters written by a black writer, written in the 1950s and 1950s slang. I must sound like an absolute fool doing that.
Right.
The best version of it I could possibly do So like I reached out to a friend of mine named David Walker, a comics writer, and I said, I didn't even tee it up. I was just like, you want to come on the show? He's like, yeah, I'd love to come on the show. I was like, who do you want to read? He's like, Donald Goines. I'm like, great. Donald Goines is on the short list of writers I am absolutely not going to be able to do on my show without sounding like a fool. And I asked Gary Phillips to come on the show. He's like, I guess I could do Chester Himes. I was like, fantastic. I'm like, I wanted you to do Chester Himes. So I'm so glad that you did Chester Himes. So, and things like, I just reposted today. I have an actress friend named Magina Tova. She was the skinny neighbor in the Spider-Man movies, the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies. She's on a TV show called Magicians. I asked her to do the show randomly. I did not know she was a big part of the Ray Bradbury Theater in Los Angeles. Knew Ray when he was alive. And she's like, can we do Fahrenheit 451? And for that one, I did a thing where I said, the scene where the main character Montague meets Clarice, I think her name is Clarice, the other main character in the book. I said, let's do it let's break it out as a play. I'll read Montague, you'll read Clarice. We'll break up the narrative. So we've had fun. Like the only time I've ever assigned someone a book is when I got to episode 42. I was like, well, I got to do the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy for episode 42. Because, 42 is the answer to life, the universe, and everything. And I reached out to a British actress friend of mine, and I said, I don't want to do my shitty British accent for Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Will you come on and read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? And she's like, oh, absolutely. That'll be great. People think of pulp. They tend to think, because of how it plays nowadays, they tend to think it means fedoras and handguns and film noir and all that. But the truth of the matter is, what the term originally means, it's anything that's printed on shitty paper. Pulp refers to the pulpy, that crappy newsprint, that things made for poor people, literally. Because literature was always, books are expensive because they're hardcover and they're bound in leather and rich people have them. And for a long time, it wasn't really, poor people got to read newspapers and magazines. And in the history of American culture, you get what's called the penny dreadfuls in the late 19th century. And that's really the first pulps. I just wrote a Nick Carter story. Nick Carter, most popular character in the 19th century, the penny dreadful detective, weekly stories. And then in the 20th century, it becomes these little magazines, the pulps. And that's Doc Savage and G8 and that all. And then in the late 30s, comic books kind of take over. Actually, I should say this, pulp split into two. There are literary pulps, and those became paperback books. People don't realize how recent paperback books are. Paperback books are about 100, 120 years old. And that's books for everybody. Books that everybody can read. You buy them for a nickel at the newsstand instead of going into the bookstore and buying the big volume for, money you can't afford. And the other stuff, the non-literary stuff in pulp magazines, comic books. That's where the superheroes come from. That's where Doc Savage becomes Superman and the Shadow becomes Batman. And so I'm fascinated by the whole history of popular culture because I'm working in it.
Right.
And I think it's good to know where it all comes from. When I was writing Zorro's just the first, it goes the Scarlet Pimpernel. Really, it goes Robin Hood in the 6th century, to the Scarlet Pimpernel in the 18th century. Rich guy who goes around beating up other rich guys wearing a mask to help the downtrodden. Then it's Zorro, then it's the Shadow, then it's Batman. And it's cool to know all that and to realize you're connected to this history of ideas, that Clark Savage comes before Clark Kent, it's cool. It's cool it is humbling to be working in those minds.
Well, last question, David.
Sure.
Is there anything else that we haven't discussed that you would like your fans, supporters to know? Any upcoming projects or appearances?
If you go to my website, davidavallonefreelance.com, you can track everything that I do and have going on. Currently, there's only one of the episodes of... I've written 3, technically 4 episodes of Bat Wheels. Only one of them is on Max at the moment. It's called Air Show Don't Tell, and it's Batwing. It's a Batwing adventure in Bat Wheels. I've got some short stories coming out in collections. There's a collection coming out called The Multiverse of Mystery, in which I wrote a Sherlock Holmes short story where Sherlock and Watson, the premise was like put Sherlock and Watson in a parallel universe where it's not Victorian England. And the editor actually said to me, please don't do sci-fi. Everyone is doing sci-fi. And just off the top of my head, because it's a world I grew up in and know, I was like, they're beat cops in Manhattan in 1977. And they were like, oh, that's great. That's completely unusual and no one's ever done it. And the funny thing is, I hadn't thought about this before I sat down, but this is the magic of doing your homework. Hadn't thought for a second about what the story was going to be. And then I start looking into what are the big criminal cases in the late 1970s in New York City. And of course, you got David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, who's saying that a dog told him to do it. I'm writing a Sherlock Holmes story, so of course I do the Hound of the Baskervilles through the lens of the son of Sam and his talking dog. It's like, I wouldn't have necessarily thought of that, but I was like, Sherlock Holmes in the late 70s, what would be interesting to Sherlock Holmes in the late 70s? Oh, the talking dog serial killer thing. That's fun. So yeah, there's a Planet of the Apes role-playing game coming out, and I have some short stories in something called the ANSA sourcebook. ANSA is the in-universe version of NASA in the Planet of the Apes world, so I got to write some great stuff about the original Planet of the Apes movie, some background on the Charlton Heston character and who he was back on Earth and what kind of a guy he was, and that was, cannot tell you how much fun that was. And coming from me next in comics, you got 8 more issues of Drawing Blood. I got some other things on the menu, but they have not been, excuse me, officially announced yet. I've been working on a 150-page Elvira graphic novel.
Oh, wow.
That I cannot talk about what it is, but I can say that it exists. And the guy just finished drawing it, so I'm hoping sometime soon that will be announced from Dynamite. And I got keep eyes open for an announcement of an original series from me called Two-Fisted Fairy Tales, which will be the most personal thing I have ever done. Very long story short, my father, World War II veteran, Pulp Fiction writer, when I was a little boy, completely true story, he told me all of the fairy tales, the famous fairy tales, as World War II combat stories about himself.
Man,
so,
baby, you got a cracking life, man. I love it.
It's as Ian Fleming used to say, it reads better than it lives.
Thank you so much. You always have a home here on the Sig Slayers station. David, thank you once again. Well, that's all for our show. If you like what you see, please subscribe and hit the like button. This is Sig Slayers. I'm Mike, speaking for Mark and David Avallone. We are out. Peace!
Sig Slayers.